Jesus Never Existed, audiobook version. A reading of the book Jesus Never Existed, The Tragic Fabrication of a Saviour of the World, by Kenneth Humphreys, copyright 2005, aka The Big Book. This audiobook project is dedicated to Kenneth Humphreys. Thanks for all your hard work and dedication, Ken. Like me, thousands are grateful for the knowledge you have imparted to them and the freedom from their mental slavery as a result. It is my sincere hope this version helps you reach thousands more. Introduction. Jesus never existed. A crackpot idea? In a culture based upon Christianity, the denial of Jesus' existence may appear at first glance absurd or even stupid. After all, goes the argument, quote-unquote mainstream scholarship accepts that there was an historical Jesus, even if there is no agreement as to actually who he was, precisely when he was, what he did, or what he said. Yet, for more than 200 years, a minority of courageous scholars have dared to question the existence of Jesus. Their skepticism and outright denial of the historical figure of Jesus is not the result of perverse obduracy in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Rather, it is a rational response to the dearth of evidence and an honest riposte to more than a suspicion of fabrication. The rebuttal of what amounts to the fake historicization of the ultimate hero, a savior who rescues followers from death itself, can now be presented in an increasingly vivid, cohesive, and reasoned exegesis. Unpalatable as it may be to some, there is nothing spiritual or miraculous in this exposition. The phantom superhero of the Christian story emerged over time and from a particular social milieu in a culture long attuned to religious synthesis. Beliefs created the man did not create the beliefs. If collective wishful thinking seems too prosaic an explanation for such a grand idea as Jesus Christ, King of Kings, reflect for a moment that the same process of fashioning a Jesus from within one's own psyche and projecting him back into an ancient pageant continues even today. It is how children have been indoctrinated generation after generation. The illusion is fragile. It requires faith because it assaults the rational senses and is confounded by every daily experience. The, quote, righteous suffer misfortune in equal measure as the ungodly. Believers are comforted that their faith is no vain illusion by the assurance that, unlike all other gods of antiquity, theirs alone had an historical presence. Few are aware just how contentious is that supposition. The quote-unquote Jesus of history was long held captive by the church itself, but from the age of enlightenment, less reverential minds gained access to the prisoner and were aghast that only a specter was to be found. That realization began a fierce war between critics and defenders of the faith. Ultimately, unable to resist advances in science and scholarly inquiry, the church marshaled its vast resources to claim the academic high ground. It established and staffed seminaries and colleges of biblical study, funded universities, and sponsored archaeological research. In consequence, most New Testament scholars have been drawn from the ranks of, quote, believers and approach their subject with a certain reverence. They are at pains not to give offense or disturb the enthusiasm of Jesus lovers, even when the evidence is clear and damning. Whatever the nuances of their particularist belief, Such scholars find themselves straddling two worlds. In one world stands a theological Jesus Christ, with whom they may well have a quote-unquote personal relationship. That Jesus is acknowledged to be a matter of faith. In the other world perambulates the quote-unquote historical Jesus. Academics of professional integrity they may be, but faith informs their mindset even as they explore this other world. Their detailed, often meticulous investigation of the history, culture, and politics of Palestine in the Second Temple period has created an historically authoritative background. The veracity of the context is not in question. Roman Judea in the 1st century AD certainly existed. But it is against this graphic background that a wafer-thin construct of, quote, Jesus makes his spectral appearance. He is intruded into the scene as a consequence of faith, not of history. For all the so-called, quote, evidences for Jesus are late and part of a forgery mill which has characterized Christianity from the 2nd century down to our own time. It is the historical context itself which allows the phantom Savior to, quote, unquote, live, die, and resurrect, and thereby cast its false shadow back upon history. We're certain that Jerusalem existed, Pharisees and Romans. Why not a Jesus? Cue the Discovery Channel documentary. These are the type of sandals Jesus would have worn. This is the type of tree he would have rested under. Inertia of the soft option. In the wider world of academia, professional historians are not necessarily engaged by any particular interest in the issue of Jesus per se. They are all too aware of its controversial nature. Raised and educated in a Christian culture, they are content to either assume Jesus lived and defer to the opinions of biblical specialists who are often men of faith, or given the paucity of evidence for a great many historical personages, preface their uncertainty with a quote-unquote probably. For example, in a recent scholarly investigation into the quote real Jesus by Geza Vermes, The Changing Faces of Jesus, 2000, the writer at no point considers that the superhero may not actually have existed beneath all the layers of invention he so assiduously peels away. Indeed, Vermes closes with a dream of a returning Christ. No doubt the same dream he had at the beginning of his study, but then he is a Jewish Catholic scholar. Similarly, the renowned historian Michael Grant, in an investigation of Jesus, is happy to pass over non-existence in a mere 2 paragraphs, yet be content with the cavalier comment, quote, Jesus was probably born at Nazareth or perhaps some other small place, unquote. Jesus, 1999, page 171. Though obliged to report again and again that there is no evidence or only fabricated, quote, evidence from a later time, he maintains an insistence throughout that the shadowy figure must be real. Contrariwise, a scholar who announces that he thinks there was no historical Jesus is likely to face scorn, even ridicule, and will gain little for his candor. It is much safer for academics to aver the, quote, probability of a man behind the legend, unquote, even while arguing that layers of crusted myth obscure knowing anything about him. This, quote, safe and frankly gutless option maintains simultaneously the, quote, obscurity of a carpenter and an ancient provincial backwater. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and an academic detachment from, quote-unquote faith issues, which raised that supposed obscure guru to an iconic status. A flawed scenario. Yet could a world faith have arisen from a non-entity who failed in his own lifetime to have been noticed by anyone? How creditable is it that a wandering rabbi who wrote nothing himself and also ran in a world full of fakers, soothsayers, and exorcists would have cast such a spell as to have reverberated through the ages? A quote minimalist Jesus is actually less satisfactory than no Jesus at all, because it still requires a search elsewhere for the roots of the new religion. And if the roots are to be found elsewhere, what need is there for the obscure personage anyway? Quote, "It is very doubtful whether the Christian faith could have been built upon the foundations of a historic Jesus, who was little more than a teacher of practical philosophy." Unquote. J. Macquarie, An Existential Theology, page 23. If we agree that a peripatetic rabbinic radical called Jesus, unnoticed in the historical record, is not implausible, then by the same token, nor would several such Jesuses be implausible. Which of them would we elect to be the basis for the Christian faith as God's only begotten Son? If it could have been any of them, then it was none of them. Either Jesus Christ was a divinity who chose to dazzle multitudes but leave no trace, who contrived to influence not the Jewish people, but a mere handful of shadowy devotees, whose successors rapidly split into numerous warring factions, or Jesus Christ is the fabrication of human minds, a construct betrayed at every turn by contradiction and omission. We are concerned here with the latter option. Those who find comfort in the first will not be reading this book. In the 21st century, we face the paradox that though the unmasking of biblical fraud has gone further than ever before, global geopolitics finances and encourages a vociferous restatement of biblical fundamentalism and inerrancy, a torrent of misinformation, the sheer quantity of which can be overwhelming. Most people have neither time nor inclination to delve deeply into the massive evidence and argument. Christian apologists are ever ready to denounce a quote-unquote Christ myther as an isolated crank on the fringes of sanity, unworthy of serious consideration. But their strident hostility hides the fear that the downfall of their superhero may not be far off, and what they can no longer deny or suppress is the fact that the exposure of quote-unquote Jesus Christ for the fabrication that it is, far from being the manic pursuit of oddballs, has been embraced and endorsed by a continuous stream of talented scholars in all countries. Signed, Kenneth Humphreys, October 2005.